let's talk about Australia. Should
Yeah.
Australia be trusted with highly enriched submarine power plants, nuclear power plants, that my understanding is that the same highly enriched uranium with some tweaks here and there can be used in weapons? So Australia has more of a past with seeking a nuclear program than some people might realize. And should they be trusted with this now?
Like there are many countries who in the past, and I'm talking the 60s, even before then, or up to the 70s, had either programs or investigations into whether they should become a nuclear weapon state. In fact, it was awareness of all of this that led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1970s as a way to try and stop all this speculation leading to proliferation. But they firmly said no. And I think the possibility that Australia would develop a weapons program because they had highly enriched uranium-fueled submarines is zero. So I don't have any problem. I don't see any path, politically or otherwise, for Australia to develop a weapons program because they have this weapons-grade uranium buried deep in the design and construction of the reactor. You cannot extract it in order to make weapons. So the problem is not what's in the reactors. You just simply can't, go in with a bucket and spade, take out the uranium and turn it into a weapon. That's fantasy. So the question is, well, how do they manage and own this submarine? And that's one of the things that's being looked at in the programmatic work that goes on in this 18 months. So there are a number of options, clearly. They could be like the US or the UK, where they own and manage the entire process from a bucket of uranium and lots of other bits of metal, and they build themselves a reactor, and they build themselves a submarine, and they put the two together, and they manage the fuel cycle from original enrichment to disposal. I think, whilst that is a possibility, I think that's extremely unlikely, given the Australian viewpoint on matters nuclear. So I think far more likely is that there will be, firstly, that the submarine core that they end up designing will be a lifetime core. So it doesn't need to be opened up and the fuel taken out and new fuel put in at some stage during the submarine's life. That's where the UK and the US have been going for some time in their design. So that removes the need to have that sort of interim infrastructure in Australia. Secondly, clearly you could, as was the case way back in the 1960s when the 58 agreement first provided a reactor to the British. It was essentially, I mean, I don't know if you remember the Thunderbirds, but Thunderbird 2, it was essentially a module that stuck in the middle of the submarine, and there was a British front end and a British machinery end and the American reactor end, and all they did was bolt all the bits together and weld up the hull. So that's an option, which is probably the most likely. It probably won't be as modular as that, but I think it is entirely possible to devise a submarine in a program where the reactor component, the nuclear component of it, comes as a single unit already sealed by the UK or US manufacturing company, and simply Australia runs it. And if there was any need to do anything to it internally, it would go back to the manufacturer, so to speak.
Okay, so that takes us around the risk with Australia to some degree of highly enriched uranium being used for a weapons program, so that there is, and we feel, according to you, you feel secure that Australia is a trusted partner. But what does it do?
Sorry, may I just elaborate slightly on that? That doesn't take away the fact that this is the first time that a non-nuclear weapon state will be an operator of a nuclear propulsion platform in a warship, in a submarine. And so there are precedents for other states for whom I may not have exactly the same confidence in their proliferation from a propulsion program to a weapons program. The door has been kicked slightly ajar.
Right, and where does that lead us? And that's the big concern by people who are worried about nuclear proliferation. South Korea would probably like nuclear submarines, to defend against North Korea. Japan, among others. And Russia, by the way, would probably be very happy to sell some of this.
Yes, as we've outlined in our paper, there is I mean, Brazil already has on record a nuclear program that is running itself. I mean, the French are providing submarine design expertise to Brazil, but I must say, under some pressure over the years from the US, have not agreed, certainly in the past, to provide Brazil with any assistance on the nuclear propulsion side of their submarine program. But Brazil is going it alone, and the submarine that will be the first of class is due in the 2040s, about the same time frame as AUKUS predicts the Australian submarine to be coming into service. So Brazil clearly is a contender for some further assistance because they already have a program, and I think India has nuclear propelled submarines. Pakistan is clearly a proliferation contender there, and you've already mentioned ROC and Japan. I think both of them, they have some internal hurdles to overcome if they do that. And I think it is extremely unlikely that either of those countries would go anywhere other than the US for assistance in that program, given who their allies are. And I think it would be extremely unusual for either Japan or Korea to say, look towards Russia or China or someone else and not the US. So I think we can speculate all we want, but I think all as far as I would say is that the AUKUS deal for the submarines has kicked this door ajar, and that raises the hackles and the risk of the non-proliferation regime. It loosens the bounds of the non-proliferation regime on all of this, because it was pretty tight after 58 and after the NPT. It's been pretty tight in terms of proliferation of propulsion technology, largely because the countries who had it wanted to keep it secret for themselves. And then there was a non-proliferation spin-off that then meant they weren't going to give it to anyone else. So there is some risk and challenge here, and there's going to need to be some very careful diplomacy within the NPT following this to maximize the shutting down of the non-proliferation regime. And one of the ways in which AUKUS will do this is very clearly bounding the supply of the uranium that fuels the reactors in such a way that it is the least proliferation possible. In other words, the less that Australia can physically get its hands on it, the more the program would suit the non-proliferation community. But
Russia may not do the same, though.
Indeed. I mean, it's early to tell, but there is an additional risk. That is for sure.
Let's move on to the fact. Okay, they're not going to be armed with nuclear weapons in Australia. The UK have nuclear weapons on board their submarines. The US does. The Russians do. But they will be armed, as I understand, with cruise missiles. These submarines will be armed with cruise missiles, which have the potential to carry a nuclear warhead, even if they are not. And the problem is, with so many arms experts are saying that when you have cruise missiles flying around, when they are inbound, a country doesn't know whether they're armed with conventional or nuclear warheads, and that introduces a real threat of response.
Yes, I mean, just to be clear, the United Kingdom and the United States at the moment only has nuclear weapons in their ballistic missile submarines. And you simply can't fit a Trident D5 into an SSN. You probably could if you ripped everything out and lay it horizontally, but you couldn't fit it into so the current nuclear weapons that are available to the US and the UK only fit in the SSBNs, and they're not going to Australia or deploying. I mean, the UK SSBNs aren't.
But they are designing new cruise missiles that can be nuclear.
The US has a program of record following the last NPR to reinvent essentially the submarine launched cruise missile that previously was the TLAM-N, which was first mothballed back in the 1990s and then effectively axed by the NPR under President Obama. Now, the new submarine launched cruise missile, SLCM-N, is not going to be a Tomahawk with a nuclear weapon on it. Probably it'll be a new missile, but it'll look awfully like a Tomahawk. The UK has no such program and will not place nuclear cruise missiles in its submarines ever, period. And it made that decision most recently in the Trident Alternatives review that came out in 2013. But the US is, at the moment, following a program of record that will place the capability to put nuclear-armed cruise missiles in its submarines. And that's,
which means the Russians will do the same and are doing the same.
Russians already have. And therefore, the sale of the conventional Tomahawk land attack cruise missile to the Australians as part of the AUKUS deal, a missile which an earlier variant they have already sold and shared with the UK, means that submarines operating in the Asia Pacific will all be carrying, so all the AUKUS submarines will also be carrying the conventional Tomahawk missile, which at the moment is not an issue for this area of nuclear risk. But the moment that the US fields or has the capability to field a nuclear-armed submarine-launched cruise missile, then for all three nations that changes. Or for all three nations, given that the most likely adversaries in the region are DPRK, North Korea, and China, both of whom are nuclear weapon or nuclear armed states, you suddenly cannot launch your conventional cruise missiles anywhere near them for fear that they would misinterpret them as a nuclear launch and react accordingly. So that is why I and others have been calling regularly. In fact, an op-ed piece on The Hill that Christine Parthamore and I wrote just last week, or published earlier this week, talks about the cruise missile risk. In fact, using the fact that North Korea had announced a test of cruise missiles, not nuclear armed, but clearly with the potential so to be. And these dual capable cruise missiles are probably the most destabilizing weapons in the nuclear weapon environment today because of this miscalculation risk. Most experts believe that the risk of nuclear conflict is not through the ego of a superpower that believes it can win a war. Indeed, Putin and Biden reiterated the Reagan-Gorbachev that a war could not be won, most recently in June of this year. It is through a miscalculated escalation that we stumble into nuclear exchanges and so on and so forth. And therefore, weapons that increase the risk of miscalculation should be removed from the orbit. So the sale of TLAM conventional to Australia for use in the Asia Pacific should be another reason why the US does not continue its submarine launched cruise missile program, nuclear cruise missile program.
So you would tell President Biden and your Prime Minister Boris Johnson, think again.
Just be absolutely clear for the second time, the UK has no program and will have no program for a nuclear launched cruise missile. This solely rests in Washington, this decision.
But the UK is going together with the US to provide the launch platform to the Australians.
We must not get confused between the fact that the AUKUS SSN and its conventional TLAM missile adds no more danger than the British SSN currently deployed in the region.
So they're not going to have crews on the Australian submarine?
They will, but this danger that I've just spoken to doesn't come into being until and unless the US deploys nuclear armed submarine cruise missiles, which they currently do not have. They will not deploy these missiles in any other nation's submarines, but because when a TLAM missile leaves the surface of the sea, having left the submarine, it has no flags on it, and you don't know whether it's American, and you don't know what its payload is.
That's the point, John, isn't it? That
the only nation that can make
they are launching cruise missiles. They are launching cruise missiles from Australian submarines that are not nuclear tipped, but may well be mistaken for an incoming nuclear missile.
Precisely. The only nation that can change that miscalculation risk is the United States by stopping and not proceeding with its submarine launched nuclear cruise missile program.